palace calendar update appears on a Tuesday. Nobody marks the date. Nobody sends an alert. It arrives the way most administrative communications arrive inside royal circles. Quietly, without ceremony, folded into the ordinary rhythm of institutional life. Column shifts. A name moves. And for most people scrolling past it, nothing registers as unusual. But one entry has changed. A responsibility. One that has been quietly, consistently, almost invisibly associated with Camilla for years, now appears beside a different name. Catherine's. At first glance it looks like a clerical correction. Perhaps a scheduling conflict. Perhaps a temporary delegation while diaries were being realigned. These things happen inside large institutions. Responsibilities get shuffled. Names get moved. And the world continues without comment. Palace watchers, though, do not work the way ordinary observers do. They do not look at what is announced. They look at what shifts. They do not read statements. They read calendars, seating arrangements, travel schedules, and the invisible geometry of who stands beside whom at which function and why. They have learned, over years of watching an institution that communicates almost entirely through signal rather than statement, that the most consequential changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive like this. A column shifted. A name moved. Nothing more. So when the entry appears, when Catherine's name occupies the space where Camilla's name has sat for years, the first response is not alarm. It is curiosity. A quiet, careful curiosity of the kind that royal observers have trained themselves to feel before they decide whether something is significant or simply administrative. The role itself carries weight. It is not one of the ceremonial positions visible during public engagements, the kind that gets photographed and captioned and discussed in the afternoon press. It belongs to a quieter category, the kind of responsibility that operates in the interior spaces of institutional life, the briefings and correspondence and advisory meetings that never appear in any official photograph but shape the direction of everything that does. Camilla has occupied this space for years. Not loudly, not in a way that draws attention or invites comparison, but consistently, in the particular way that influence inside major institutions tends to work, through repetition, through presence, through the accumulation of small interactions that eventually form the texture of how decisions get made and which voices carry weight in which rooms. And now that space has a different name beside it. Most people who see the update scroll past it. But a small number of palace watchers pause. They look again. They note the change without yet knowing what to make of it. And then, almost immediately, they begin noticing something else. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Because the schedule change, it turns out, was not the only thing that moved. In the days following that quiet Tuesday update, a second adjustment appears. Then a third. Each small. Each individually explainable. Each the kind of thing that would disappear without comment if it existed alone. But they do not exist alone. They arrive in sequence. And sequences inside institutions that communicate through signal rather than statement rarely happen by accident. Palace watchers begin comparing notes. The curiosity that started as a pause, a simple double-take at a shifted column on a routine calendar, starts becoming something more focused. Something is changing. The only question is what? And nobody inside the palace is offering any explanation at all. Patterns do not announce themselves. That is the first thing to understand about how influence moves inside institutions like this one. It does not arrive with a statement. It does not call a press conference. It does not issue a formal declaration of intent. It accumulates, quietly, over days and weeks and sometimes months, until one morning, someone looks back at what has happened and realizes the landscape has already shifted underneath them. This is what begins happening in the weeks that follow the calendar change. The first adjustment was easy to explain away. A scheduling conflict. A temporary delegation. The kind of routine administrative movement that happens inside any large and complex institution managing dozens of overlapping calendars, obligations, and logistical pressures. The second adjustment is slightly harder to dismiss. Catherine begins appearing in a space that has, for years, belonged to Camilla's orbit. Not dramatically, not in a way that displaces or replaces or announces a transfer. Simply present. quietly visible in a room or on a briefing list or beside a particular advisor, where she has not typically been present before. Observers note it. They do not yet know what to do with it. The third adjustment makes it harder to ignore. And then there is the behavior of the advisors. Those who work closest to the interior of these decisions, the people who move between households, who manage the invisible logistics of institutional life, who understand which changes matter and which are genuinely administrative, begin appearing unusually active. Not in a visible, traceable way, but palace watchers who pay attention to patterns of movement, of communication, of who is meeting with whom and with what frequency, begin noticing the particular quality of busyness that tends to surround a decision that has already been made rather than one still being considered. That is a specific quality. It has a texture to it, and experienced observers recognize it. Meanwhile, the palace says nothing. This too is noticed, because in a communications environment as carefully managed as this one, silence is not passive. Silence is selected. Every absence of statement is a decision. Every absence of clarification is a choice. And the particular silence that descends in the weeks following these changes has the quality of something deliberate. Not ignorance, not oversight, but a controlled withholding of explanation that only deepens the curiosity it was perhaps intended to suppress. Every clue, examined individually, appears insignificant. The calendar change could be administrative. The new visibility could be coincidental. The advisor activity could be unrelated. The silence could simply be the ordinary reticence of an institution that rarely explains anything. Each element alone means nothing. Together they form something. Not a conclusion. Not yet, but a pattern. The kind that experienced palace watchers recognize before they fully understand what they are looking at. The visual impression of a change in motion before the change has completed itself. Observers begin exchanging observations. A particular theory starts forming, tentative, incomplete, but gathering shape. It makes sense. It explains the calendar change, the new visibility, the unusual advisor activity, the silence. It holds together. For a moment, it feels like the beginning of an answer. And then something unexpected happens. A meeting occurs. Quiet. Unreported. Known only through the particular kind of inference that palace watchers have developed across years of studying an institution that reveals its interior life only in fragments and traces. And the meeting does not fit the theory. The pattern that seemed to be emerging suddenly looks more complicated. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand something about the way power moves inside institutions like this one. Most people, looking from the outside, focus on the visible architecture. The titles, the ceremonies, the formal occasions that get photographed and broadcast and discussed in the afternoon press. And those things are real. They carry meaning. They communicate hierarchy and continuity and the particular grammar of institutional life. But they are not where influence lives. Influence lives in the interior spaces, in the regular briefings, in the correspondence that passes between advisors and principals, in the conversations that happen before the formal meetings that shape what gets decided inside them, in the quiet accumulation of access, who is present when decisions are discussed, whose perspective is sought before a position is formed, whose name appears on the documents that circulate before anything becomes official. The responsibility now carrying Catherine's name belongs to this interior world. It is not a ceremonial role. It does not appear in official photographs. It does not generate headlines on its own. For years, it has operated in precisely the kind of invisible space that most observers, even experienced ones, rarely think to examine. Because it seems on the surface like administration, like coordination, like the unglamorous logistics of keeping a complex institutional life organized and functional. But that appearance is exactly what makes it significant. Because inside major institutions, the roles that appear administrative are often the ones through which real influence flows. Not because they grant formal authority, they rarely do, but because they grant proximity, access, presence in rooms where the conversations that shape decisions are happening. The person who coordinates a briefing is present during the briefing. The person who manages an advisory process is present during the advisory process. Presence repeated over time compounds. It builds familiarity. It builds trust. It builds the particular kind of informal influence that is harder to name and therefore harder to remove than anything written into a formal title. Camilla understood this. Not explicitly, perhaps. Not as a strategy articulated in any document. But institutions select for this understanding. They reward the people who grasp how influence actually moves, quietly, through access, through presence, through the patient accumulation of proximity, and they do so by continuing to route important work through the hands of those people. For years, the work routed through Camilla. Now something has shifted, and the shift is significant not simply because of who is involved, but because of what the role itself represents. It is not merely a responsibility being transferred from one person to another. It is an entire mode of influence, a way of being embedded in the interior of institutional decision-making that is being redirected. This is about stewardship, not status, not competition, not the kind of interpersonal drama that palace coverage tends to reach for when it runs out of structural analysis. This is about which figure in which generation sits closest to the center of how an institution operates in its most important, least visible moments. For a brief period, the interpretation circulating among palace watchers seems generous. Perhaps Catherine is helping temporarily. Perhaps Camilla has a scheduling conflict, a health consideration, a personal reason for stepping back from this particular responsibility that will resolve itself in time, returning the calendar to its previous configuration. It is a reasonable reading. But then reports begin circulating suggesting something that makes the generous interpretation harder to maintain. The responsibilities themselves are changing, not just who holds them, what they encompass. By the time the third week arrives, a consensus has formed. Royal commentators, the established voices whose analysis shapes how these developments get interpreted by a wider public, appear to have arrived at an explanation. The coverage settles. The framing converges. Transition, the commentary suggests, generational, planned. The palace managing the careful, deliberate process by which responsibilities move from one era to the next in a way that preserves continuity and minimizes disruption. It is a tidy explanation. It fits the observable facts. The calendar change, the new visibility, the advisor activity, the silence. All of it maps onto a familiar institutional narrative, the monarchy managing succession planning in the methodical, unsentimental way that large institutions manage succession planning. Nothing personal. Nothing dramatic. Simply the gears of a centuries-old machine turning in the direction they have always eventually turned. Most observers accept this. The story appears finished. And then something shifts at the edges. An advisor, one connected to the structural roots of how the palace has managed its internal dynamics across more than one generation, becomes unusually visible. Not publicly, not in any way traceable through official channels, but in the particular way that experienced palace watchers have learned to notice, through patterns of presence, through the inference drawn from who is seen traveling where, through the quiet accumulation of details that resist the clean narrative the commentators have settled on. This advisor does not fit the succession planning story. Their visibility, in this moment, suggests something more complicated. They belong to a tradition of institutional management that predates Catherine's increasing prominence. They are associated with structures that have, historically, resisted rather than enabled rapid transitions of the kind the current commentary describes. Their presence raises a question. If this is straightforward succession planning, organized, deliberate, fully sanctioned from above, why is someone connected to the resistance of such transitions suddenly and quietly active? Observers who had settled into the comfortable explanation begin looking again. Because there is a difference between a role transferring and a role transforming. Transfer is a clean concept. It implies that something moves from one location to another, arriving intact and unchanged. The same responsibility in new hands. The same scope with a different name. Transformation is something else. Transformation implies that the thing itself is changing in the process of moving. That what arrives on the other side is not what existed before. Not simply relocated but restructured. Given new edges, new weight, new reach. Made into something the original version was not. If the role is transferring, the succession planning explanation holds. If the role is transforming, the story is more complicated. and the presence of an advisor connected to institutional conservatism, to the kind of palace thinking that prioritizes the preservation of existing structures over their adaptation, in the middle of what is supposedly a smooth and planned transition, suggests that not everyone inside the institution agrees with what is happening, or agrees on what it means. The false resolution holds for approximately 2 weeks. Then it begins fracturing at its seams. And underneath the consensus, a much more interesting question begins emerging. Not who is taking over, but what exactly is changing, and whose vision of the institution's future is currently winning. The first theory is elegant. It is the kind of explanation that satisfies because it makes everything fit. The calendar change, the new visibility, the advisor activity, the silence. Read through the lens of succession planning, all of it has a place. Institutions of this age and complexity do not change leadership or responsibility structures impulsively. They plan. They organize. They move deliberately over months and sometimes years, preparing the ground before making the change visible. What looks sudden to an outside observer has often been in motion for a long time. Catherine's increasing visibility fits this pattern. Her preparation, the years of careful, disciplined accumulation of institutional knowledge, of relationship building with the advisors and structures that shape how the palace actually operates, fits this pattern. The timing fits. The scale of the changes fits. And yet, there are things that do not fit. Traditional succession planning inside institutions of this kind follows a particular choreography. There are signals. There are gradual, visible escalations of responsibility that serve the dual purpose of preparing the successor and communicating the transition to the stakeholders, both internal and external, who need to process and accept it. There are rarely abrupt calendar changes that appear without context or explanation. There are rarely advisor patterns that suggest something other than smooth, agreed-upon management. The advisor who became visible in Chapter 4 does not fit. The silence does not fit. Succession planning, when it is deliberate and organized and fully sanctioned, tends to generate at least some supporting communication. Not a press conference, not a statement, but the quiet confirmation that leaks into commentary. The nod from the right source to the right journalist at the right moment that signals, yes, this is what you think it is. That nod has not come, which means either the succession planning reading is incomplete, or something is happening alongside it that the succession planning narrative does not account for. Sometimes institutions reveal their future by what they stop doing. This is a more useful frame for the current moment, because what the palace has stopped doing, what is conspicuously absent from the pattern, is any of the usual institutional signaling that accompanies deliberate, planned transitions. The briefings that place context around changes. The coordinated commentary that frames developments in ways that suit the institution's preferred narrative. The visible endorsement, however subtle, from the figures who hold the authority to sanction what is happening. None of that has appeared, which raises a question the succession planning theory cannot comfortably answer. What if this was not fully planned? What if some part of what is happening, not the change itself perhaps, but the speed of it or the scope of it, or the particular shape it is taking, represents a negotiation still in progress rather than a decision already made? The timing still does not make sense under the succession planning reading, because succession planning happens over time. It builds. It prepares the institution and the people inside it for the change that is coming. The calendar entry that appeared on a Tuesday without context, without supporting communication, without the institutional scaffolding that typically surrounds this kind of transition, that is not the signature of something that has been in deliberate preparation for months. That is the signature of something that has accelerated. And accelerations, inside institutions built to move slowly and deliberately, are almost always symptoms of pressure. A second theory begins circulating. One that fits the evidence the succession planning reading leaves unexplained. The second theory is more ambitious. It begins with the same observable facts, the calendar change, the new visibility, the advisor activity, the silence, but reads them through a different lens. Not succession planning. Not the smooth institutional management of generational transition. Something larger. The monarchy is modernizing. This theory holds that what is happening around Catherine's name, the expanding responsibilities, the shifting presence, the gradual occupation of spaces that have historically belonged to an older model of royal influence, is not simply about who holds what role. It is about what the institution is becoming, about the kind of monarchy that will exist in 10 years, 20 years, a generation from now. And the argument in this reading is that what looks like a scheduling change is actually a structural shift, the first visible sign of an institution quietly reorganizing itself around a different center of gravity. The evidence for this reading is compelling. Catherine's public profile has been changing. Not dramatically, not in the kind of sudden, conspicuous way that generates headlines, but in the measured, deliberate accumulation of substance, the initiatives with institutional weight, the partnerships with organizations that carry cultural authority, the development of a public identity that is less purely ceremonial and more substantively engaged with the social and civic questions that shape public life in the present moment. This is not the profile of someone being prepared for succession in the traditional sense. This is the profile of someone building a form of influence designed for a different institutional moment. The modernization theory fits that profile. And yet, several traditional structures remain completely untouched. The ceremonies that have defined royal public life for generations continue unchanged. The institutional relationships that have historically governed how the palace engages with government, with the press, with the public calendar, they show no sign of restructuring. The visible architecture of the monarchy, the parts that are most easily photographed and discussed and understood as representative of what the institution is, none of that has shifted, which creates an interesting problem for the modernization theory. If the institution is genuinely modernizing, if what is happening around Catherine represents a structural reorganization rather than a personnel transfer, you would expect to see some disruption in the traditional structures alongside the new development. Modernization is not additive. It is not simply the creation of new forms alongside the preservation of old ones. It involves the reorganization of how things actually work. It touches the traditional structures precisely because it changes the relationship between what exists and what is emerging. The traditional structures remain intact. So either the modernization is more cosmetic than structural, a change in personnel rather than a change in the institution's operating logic, or it is happening in a way so interior, so embedded in the invisible spaces of institutional life, that it is not yet visible even to experienced observers. Every answer creates a new question. If you're finding these shifts as fascinating as royal observers have, take a moment to like the video. What comes next may completely change the way this story is viewed. Because in revisiting the earliest details, the specific calendar entry, the precise sequence of subsequent adjustments, the particular advisor whose visibility did not fit either theory, observers noticed something they had passed over in the initial examination. A detail so small it had registered without being examined. A detail that, looked at again with the weight of everything that has accumulated since, suddenly means something different. The smallest clue becomes the most important one. No clarification arrives. This is itself a fact, a significant one. In a communications environment as carefully managed as the palace's, one in which every public statement, every press release, every officially sanctioned leak to a trusted journalist is the product of deliberate decision-making rather than spontaneous disclosure, the absence of clarification is not passive. It is selected. It is a choice. The question is, what does the choice communicate? Inside major institutions, silence rarely means nothing. It means something specific, especially when what it means is deliberately ambiguous. Silence can be strategic, the withholding of explanation that keeps options open, that prevents a developing situation from being defined before the institution is ready to define it on its own terms. Silence can be protective, the refusal to comment on something that, if commented upon, would require acknowledgement of a complication the institution is not yet prepared to address publicly. And silence can be communicative in the most direct sense, the message sent precisely through what is not being said. The palace's silence in this moment has a particular quality. It is not the silence of disinterest. The updates to Catherine's calendar, the expanding responsibilities, the new visibility, the steady accumulation of institutional presence in spaces previously associated with Camilla, are not the kind of development that the palace's communications infrastructure would fail to notice. They are observed, they are known, and the decision not to contextualize them, not to offer the briefing, the background conversation, the carefully framed explanation that would allow the story to be understood in the terms the palace prefers, is itself a form of management. But management of what? This is where the silence becomes the most interesting thing in the entire story. Because the palace has historical options when something sensitive is developing. It can front-run, get ahead of a story by providing its own framing before external interpretation has time to calcify. It can deflect, route attention elsewhere, toward other developments that draw scrutiny away from the sensitive area. It can acknowledge at a minimum sufficient to prevent wild speculation from filling the vacuum. All of these are available. All of these have been deployed before, in situations carrying similar or greater sensitivity. None of them has appeared, which means the palace has decided, for reasons not visible from the outside, that the silence itself is the preferred posture, not as a temporary holding position, not as a placeholder while a communication strategy is assembled, but as the strategy. And when silence is the strategy rather than the symptom, it usually means one of two things. Either the situation is more complicated than the external narrative has grasped. There are moving parts still in motion, negotiations still ongoing, a conclusion not yet reached, and speaking prematurely would lock the institution into a position it may need to revise. Or the situation is exactly as it appears, and the institution has calculated that any explanation would draw more attention to the development than the silence does. What is not being said is becoming more important than what is. Palace watchers return to the beginning. They pull up the calendar entry that started everything. They look again at the sequence of subsequent adjustments. They look at the detail, the small, specific, easily overlooked detail, that they flagged weeks earlier and then set aside. It has been sitting there the whole time. And seen from where the story stands now, it does not read the way it read at the beginning. The beginning of a story and the middle of a story are rarely about the same thing. This is one of the structural truths of how major institutional changes unfold. What appears to be the subject at the start, the visible, named, discussable element that draws initial attention, is almost never the real territory of the change. The real territory reveals itself slowly, through the accumulation of adjacent details, through the connections between things that seemed, at first, to belong to separate narratives, through the moment when you step back far enough that the individual elements stop being individual and start forming a shape. The shape here is not what early observations suggested. In the beginning, the story appeared to be about two women, about Catherine and Camilla, about the particular dynamics of a royal household navigating the question of who holds what responsibility at which moment in the institutional life cycle. Personal, interpersonal, personnel. The kind of story that palace coverage reaches for almost reflexively, because it is familiar and it provides characters around which narrative can cohere. But the early clues, revisited now, connected to everything that has accumulated since, tell a different story. The advisor whose visibility did not fit the succession planning theory. Recall where that advisor belongs historically, not to either of the women at the center of the external narrative, but to the institutional structures themselves, to the palace as a system, to the accumulated weight of decisions and precedents and arrangements that shape how the institution operates below the level of any individual's authority or influence. That advisor's presence was not about Catherine or Camilla. It was about the institution responding to something. And the thing the institution was responding to, this is the connection that was always there in the early details waiting to be made, is a tension that has been building for years between continuity and adaptation. Between the institutional logic that has governed the palace across generations, the logic of preserving structure, of managing change slowly, of treating tradition as a form of stability that serves the institution's legitimacy, and a different institutional logic that is emerging around the next generation. A logic that treats adaptation not as a threat to legitimacy but as a condition for it. This is not a personal conflict. It is a structural one. And it is playing out through the most available means that structural conflicts have inside major institutions. The allocation of responsibility. The arrangement of access. The quiet, invisible decisions about who sits in which rooms, who appears on which briefing lists, whose name occupies which line in a palace calendar. The story was never fully about Camilla or Catherine. It was about the institution using both of them, their roles, their positions, their institutional relationships, to work through a much older question about what it means to preserve something while allowing it to change. Continuity versus adaptation, not as a personal drama, as an institutional one. And the institution itself, the centuries-old system of expectations and precedents and invisible negotiations that has survived by being far more adaptable than it appears, has become the central character. The two theories that seemed to compete, succession planning and modernization, were not wrong. They were incomplete. They were readings of parts of a larger pattern that neither framing by itself was wide enough to contain. The real question was never who gets the role. It was what the role is becoming, and whether the institution can manage that transformation without fracturing the appearance of seamlessness that is, itself, one of its most carefully preserved assets. There is a moment in every major institutional change when the people inside the institution know that something has shifted, but the world outside has not yet registered it. The change is real. It is in motion. It has already begun reshaping the interior landscape. Who has access, who is consulted, whose presence is sought in the rooms where things are decided. But its outward surface still looks the same. The ceremonies continue. The photographs look familiar. The official communications carry the usual cadence. And so the world outside reads continuity, while the people inside are already living in a different arrangement. This gap between the interior reality and the exterior appearance is not accidental. It is one of the most powerful tools that major institutions possess. Because change that is invisible while it is happening is change that cannot be contested in the moment it is occurring. By the time the external world registers that something has shifted, the shift has already settled. It has had time to become the new normal. The new arrangement has accumulated its own momentum, its own institutional legitimacy, its own set of relationships and precedents built around the reality of how things now actually work. And contesting something that has already become normal is a very different project than contesting something still in motion. What is happening around Catherine belongs to this tradition. Not as a strategy she has personally designed and executed. That framing would be too simple, too individual, too focused on agency in a context where the most important forces are structural. But as an institutional process of which she is the instrument, in the way that individuals inside major institutions are often the instruments of forces larger than their own intentions. She is not challenging anyone. She is not displacing anyone. She is doing what institutions select for, being present, being prepared, being visible in the right spaces at the right moments, and allowing the accumulation of that presence to do what it always does. Change the texture of how things work. Quietly, incrementally, in a way that is almost impossible to mark with a specific date or event. This is what power looks like when nobody notices. It is not dramatic. It is not announced. It does not arrive with a statement or a ceremony or a formal transfer of authority that makes the moment legible and therefore contestable. It arrives the way a season changes. You look up one morning and the light is different, and you realize it has been different for weeks. And the moment when it changed is not recoverable. Influence rarely announces its arrival. It becomes visible only after people realize the room has already changed. This is the lesson that every person who has spent time inside a major institution eventually learns. The formal architecture, the titles, the ceremonies, the official structures of authority matters. Provides the grammar. Sets the frame. But within that frame, the actual movement of influence is informal, incremental, relational, and almost entirely invisible in the moment it is happening. By the time it is visible, it is already done. One question still remains unanswered. Not about Catherine. Not about Camilla. Not about which advisor appeared in which corridor or which name appeared in which calendar entry or which theory best explains the particular sequence of events that began on a quiet Tuesday with an update nobody was watching for. A different question, larger, about the institution itself. And the more you look at it, the more it seems like that unanswered question may be the entire point. No announcement was made. No confirmation came. No press release arrived in journalists' inboxes with a subject line that would have made the story clean, would have given it a definitive shape, would have allowed it to be filed and understood and moved past. The palace communicated in the way it has always communicated when it is managing something it is not yet prepared to name, through the accumulation of observable facts, arranged in a sequence that invites interpretation without offering resolution. The calendar change is real. The new visibility is real. The expanding scope of Catherine's presence in the interior spaces of institutional life is real. The advisor activity is real. The silence is real. What is not real, what has never existed in this story or in most stories of institutional change that matter, is a single, clean, definitive moment of transfer. A before and after. A ceremony that marks the line between what was and what is. Institutions do not generally work this way. The ones that have lasted centuries, the ones that have survived regime changes and cultural upheaval and the particular pressure of living in public, have done so precisely because they are better than any individual actor at absorbing change without appearing to, at making adaptation look like continuity, at allowing the new arrangement to become normal before the old arrangement has been formally declared over. The monarchy has done this before. Royal history shows it, not in the dramatic transitions that get recorded in textbooks, but in the hundreds of smaller, quieter reorganizations of influence and access and institutional gravity that have happened in the interior of this institution across centuries, most of them invisible to the people living alongside them, recognizable only in retrospect. What is happening now belongs to this tradition. Catherine, in this reading, is not a challenger or a reformer or a competitor. She is a custodian, someone in whom the institution is, whether by design or by the patient logic of proximity, investing the particular kind of embedded authority that will allow the monarchy to remain coherent as it navigates the transition between one generation of leadership and the next. Whether Camilla is part of this design or adjacent to it, or in a relationship with it more complex than either of those descriptions captures, that is not knowable from the outside. Perhaps not fully knowable from the inside. The moments that shape institutions are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that disappear into routine, and leave people wondering years later whether they imagined the shift at all. Was this a transfer of influence? Was it a modernization effort, the palace quietly reorganizing itself around a center of gravity better suited to the decades ahead? Was it simply the first visible sign of a transformation still unfolding, still incomplete, still negotiating with itself in the interior spaces where the most consequential institutional changes have always happened? Or was it something more patient still? Not a change at all in the formal sense, but simply the continuation of a process that has been running for years, now surfacing briefly into visibility before descending again into the ordinary, unexamined rhythm of how a centuries-old institution moves through time. No answer arrives. None may ever arrive in a form legible enough to satisfy the question. But behind palace walls, in the briefings and the calendars and the quiet accumulation of presence and access and trust, something has shifted. It shifted quietly. It shifted on a Tuesday. And by the time anyone fully understood what had moved, the room had already changed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.